So, to use this test material as a first example, it was just this image, which I thought was nothing special, but somewhat interesting, rather structural, which I think was helpful, like underneath the picture. But in the beginning, I had nothing else. And then I started thinking, okay, what do I see? And the first thing I saw, like, which was an interesting quality, that you have this sort of library-like walls. But then there are these branches growing, or trees growing on the library walls, which created this idea of that, like, what if there is an operation which is taking material sources, of course, can be text, like in the image, can be books, but could be anything. But then there is a main operation which is or operations that are about growth from the material, like taking some material, say book or text, and growing from it. And this is here the branching growth. And I started kind of sketching out like that's nourished by sources, and sketching out like an op of growth. Like the exclamation point here is that this is still on a to-do, but like how does it, like this sort of material that I already made from it was this sort of idea, like, okay, what is an operation of forming roots from sources? Like, how do you take, say, text and form roots from it? What are your operations of transforming it? And what are your operations of growing foliage from it? Like, and here the idea was that because there's this foliage, is like you grow roots from it, but when you find something fertile when you're growing from it, it's essentially like growing foliage. So it's still the image informing that, but it creates this interesting structural idea of, like, when you're growing from the text, you're deviating from it. But then when that growth takes you into an interesting spot, you can start to grow something out of it, essentially leaves and foliage. And this was something that I then played with, like making a role, which I called reader sculptures, that was that the read sources towards sculpting instruments from it. There could be other readers here, but this was just the one idea. And once again, it would have its own operations. What is the sculpting? What is the extraction? What is the shaping? And how do they use these instruments? Like, how do they experiment with them? And so this I can show you here. It's my combined Obsidian logseq database. So I started essentially pulling, once again, not selecting some text that is somehow magnificent or great. I think these are from, most of them are from Codex of Infinite Planes, which is a role-playing book I happen to have in hand. So, but I was mostly like testing if I take these quotes, which are here marked with the brackets, like, how do I sculpt out of this? Like, which is the form of growth now, what I'm thinking of. Like, I'm now reading to sculpt out of it. So here in this quote, there was like, so there was this mountain that is semi-solid. It's made of clouds, but within its bulk, there is a creation of tunnels that are propped up by special braces that keep it from collapsing. Like, how does a cloud tunnel, like, isn't it to form something into the cloud that resembles a tunnel? Which was an interesting thought. So I just then made an operation that I'll cut something out of it, or reword it with a question mark, braces to fortify tunnels into clouded structures. Then that question mark, then to produce further growth, was well, the one thing I can say is like the operation of naming something or framing something is to create solidity to abstractness. Like if I take a weird phenomena and I give it a name and I frame it, I define it, I'm essentially creating bracing structures out of the abstractness. But then that opened this question of like, because it's talking about tunnels, like what is the nature of a tunnel? Well, that I could answer that, well, tunnel is something that can be advanced as a direction. So then I left the seed, which was the point of this growing of the foliage, is like concepts and similar structures as tunnels. Like how do you treat them as like tunnels, corridors, etc., which is actually kind of sensible, I think. Like if you stop and really think about the concept, it starts to behave like a tunnel. You travel onwards upon it or through it, and but at the same time, this was proof of concept of this operation. Now we have a slice of moment in this organization of the sculpting reading, and there's a form for the sculpting reading in itself. So. And once again, like I had none of these ideas before I started looking at this image. And of course, this image doesn't have any of these things said out loud. But then I added like I made this like there were these figures of a raven and a dog, Hound, and for example, the raven could be something that observes the branches. And I didn't write it down yet, but then that created this interesting image of a process in my mind that somebody or some bodies are essentially growing from these sources and creating these sort of growing points. Like suddenly there's this idea of a concept as a tunnel, and what the raven is making observations. And then it's a matter of what kind of observational techniques. Maybe it highlights something. And then for the hound, because it had a bone, that created this idea that it can know some bones. Well, bones can be like crystallizations from sources, something like a tough structure. So from there, one could think of like, well, you could give a special role that somebody takes something that is a hard question. Let's think of, for example, concepts and similar structures as tunnels, and maybe the hounding of that is just repeating and repeating that, not even trying to progress upon it, but like tackle it from different directions, like hack upon it, because while it's a tough question in itself, it could produce a lot of things. And it's an interesting role, potentially. And then there were some other ideas, like how it's interesting that in this picture, the walls seem to be made, like the books really seem to be, or the bookcases seem to be forming walls. So what would be an organization which uses its sources, like these texts, as its walls and constructs its buildings out of these texts themselves? Which is sort of possible. Then I made actually a real world connection. Well, actually universities sort of do that. Like, of course, they have real buildings, but how the departments and different fields of science is actually kind of making walls out of sources. Like there is some paradigm text establishing an area, more texts are formed, and that then becomes a department in itself. This is forming walls from the sources. But of course, one could take that practice approach in other ways as well. And what is the architecture then? Of course, one could easily take it then as an architecture of academics or academia, but there could be other possibilities. And like put some other things here, like the stars came this idea of attractors because the things were growing towards them. But then because they are a constellation, then I thought of the idea of what is, if the attractors are like goals, what is a goal constellation? Like yes, we can set this goal that here's our intent, but what if we make the constellation out of different goals? How does that behave? And once again, structurally, maybe not non-existing, but unusual idea, but potential idea. And this all took me, I don't know, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And at the end, I have this sort of, well, I have ideas in itself that are well, generally unusual. That's one thing. But secondly, I have this sort of almost like a small little organizational game that might be a draft version 0.2 level thing, but it's still like you can see this, like if one plays this organization, it's like it finds different sources. Maybe it's very book oriented or text oriented, or maybe it takes photographs or whatever. Then it has this mechanics of sculpting from those sources, like, and that's one part of play, that you read text in a certain manner, like the sort of a, you could call it a play test, what I was doing here, like sculpting out of the text different things. Then it can have these other roles that play with this process of when something is grown out of the text itself or the sources, whatever they are. And then if one would figure out maybe a little bit more to the other roles, and also maybe this sort of constellation of goals, like how could you use that, you would already have this sort of with a little bit of practical information, you could have this sort of playable organization in itself. So all of this was for me like an example of this sort of a way of gleaning something like in an organizational manner, which is an well, first of all, I don't think it could happen without the sort of thinking models that we have produced over time, like how to think about roles, how there is this sort of general operations nature, how to make types, how to see things as scenes, and like I think it all of that is dependent on that instrumentation that provides. But it's also like pointing towards this sort of generation of interesting organizational material, like building blocks, which can be developed and taken also elsewhere, like maybe different reading techniques actually become used somewhere else, that the reading techniques could be moved somewhere else and become a basis of something, of another organizational moment, and so on and so forth. But anyway, I talked too long, as usual, but hopefully that gave at least in some sense of an example of this sort of, let's say, methodical taking apart of a source towards gleaning out an organization from it. Or maybe it didn't, but that's up to you to evaluate, and maybe you can use questions if it didn't, or if it did.
Yeah, regarding this image, definitely did, or well, as I understood it, like I like the kind of flow that is also present in this image in a suggestive way, kind of finding sources, sculpting out of the sources, then like reaching for something, maybe some sort of like network of goals, and these like goals, they might have like more like synergies with each other, or then again like trade-offs with each other, like preventing each other from or making it more hard to reach other goals when going for one goal. and so on. And this is really kind of it's wonderful way how it is present in this image after you kind of expressed it, and I find it very well, like expressed and aligned and so on. And of course what it makes is like it would be very interesting to try out another image and see kind of how would that then work, and what kind of like flows in a sense would occur.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of thinking, like if the approach is like approachable enough, like at least to get a sense of it, then we could use that to images are good sources, like other sources would be completely possible, but images are kind of a good starting point. But I had like I collected some, like of course one could pick any images, like this was among the, let me see, I should have the window open, yeah. So I'll just put it on the screen. This was one of my like candidates. I mean, it's hard to put it on the screen because it's such a, but you can take parts of it on the screen in itself. But like if one scrolls closer and goes, you have this sort of facing structuring, and then you have these windows with different scenes essentially, um, with different activity. So I thought this, in a way, might be an interesting source. Some others I can show, like, so like maybe it's I can give an example on some of this because this I considered. Like here, I thought of it's interesting how it's actually a kind of proposal of networks. Now that I'm learning this technique of like, okay, so you have this sort of red networking that is growing on green, and then also I counted as part of the red network as growing around like these trees here, on some of the sources, like thinking of water as sources. But then you have another, which is a floating network that is like possibly intentionally separated from the actual matter at hand, maybe the actual organization. And then maybe a third network, which was like the trees are very high and narrow, so they are visible network. They are more in terms of the distance that you can see them at far, and they form kind of constellations in this. So that's three network proposals, and which came in about 30-40 seconds, just looking at this image, which is sort of like interesting. As and once again, like it's the forms are unusual. It's not that these are necessarily immediately applicable, but they're already speaking, like even these examples, way beyond this sort of bottleneck that is the concept of a network, which we use to mean gazillion million things. It's more talking about analytic forms, and proposing different kind of behaviors. This was sort of interesting in kind of similar sense. Didn't really use it, and I thought this was also like this was in. I didn't use this, but this was one of the candidates that I thought, because there were so many things going on, like similarity between the artificial and the sort of natural, the rings, etc. And this similarly, like for similar reasons, interesting. Um, uh, this, of course, was the one I used. From here, like just a note that it created immediately a couple of things. I don't know if the image is interesting, but just like it made me think like what is an like operation of this organization, or XORG, maybe to think about it like a game organization where you like haphazardly build a basis. like in a way that you cover all the empty spots. Like how do you like build a basis for an organization essentially like throwing stuff together, because I mean, of course, because of the floor here. And what kind of activity is that? Like what is the fast, rapid way of throwing like repurposed stuff to create the basis for an organization? And of course that can create like real thoughts, or let's say thoughts that are already present in the world, like your loan forms, etc. But also other thoughts, and then like also like I thought about like what does it mean that you build like organization by throwing stuff to connect treasures, which is you can think of them as assets, but also like information, competence, etc. What does it mean that inside the assets competence there is the almost like a totem for the dead? Like what is the dead here? Which is an interesting thing to think about. Okay, that might be, of course, you could easily think like earlier sources, dead writers, but it was also the idea that it came from it was like how, like for everything that has become important to you, there are dead things that were discarded when they were made. Like there was a process and many things were cut off. So how would an organization that kind of looks at its like a toolkit of techniques, which is its asset, how would it kind of totemize all the things that they have discarded in its process? Once again, an unusual idea, but not necessarily at all insensible. But yeah, but we could pick any picture. These were just some. I thought this was also interesting, but I didn't do anything with it.
Pekko, just questions. Where are you sourcing those unusual kinds of pictures? Is there some specific weird, interesting picture library, or is it? Yeah, how do you find those things?
Well, there's a couple of sources. Like there's always Pinterest, because Pinterest has a good algorithm towards like recognizing the image shape. Like it's surprisingly good in terms of like if you learn to search with Pinterest, you're almost looking like, okay, I want these kind of shapes, and then you can like essentially navigate through shapes. But I also use the scroller, which is with 3 L's. It's like misspelled scroller. I think it's com.com, which is a website that is essentially crawls the whole Reddit image subreddits, or not maybe every one of them, but most of them. And so, do I have it open actually? I think so. Yeah. So scroller, like here is like the title here is actually the subreddit. Like there's like bunch of these imaginary temples, and uh, and this is actually moving within random images from imaginary temples. But then let's see. So this is imaginary cityscapes, and the scroller is just an interface for quickly moving between them, because of course you can also look at them like this, you know. But then they have a actually fairly bad but interesting, like more like this. Uh, so I picked that image, and it's actually mostly using this subreddits themselves. Like now it's imaginary waterfalls, pathways, derelicts, and then they try to sell me the subscription, but I won't take it. Bodyscapes, etc. And there is a certain kind of style in this, although like there is variance as well if you end up in the realm of photo subreddits where people send their photos, etc. they're all here. What I like about Scroller is that you have this sort of the wackiness of Reddit combined with this sort of quick interface is quite useful. I use others as well, but like those come to mind immediately, like as sources. But it's also like a lot of that takes you to, say, to ArtStation or Behance or DeviantArt or whatever there are like this, and then you can look for certain artists. Like if you find, like, of course, like this is also good with Scroller, is that because they end up in let's see, something that's probably ArtStation. So you can always go to the source, and here they usually have the source of a source. Like now in the Reddit, we can click here, and we're now at ArtStation. Not that this artist is necessarily the most interesting, but now you have the page of that artist. So if an artist was interesting, you can then look at the other stuff that they have made. So that there's this other this kind of techniques that you can use in addition to that. So I kind of developed this sort of different crawling methods, partly to test out different generation methods, because images are a good source of generation. So I want to have like different ways of navigation through it. So that's why I have developed these a bit. But yeah, any image that would be interesting can be your own pickings as well if you have candidates.
I liked those. I liked those like sea landscapes, seascapes, and then I also liked the where you had these like gold coined assets with the skulls. So yeah, these all I liked. Yeah, and I definitely like this. So that you were already describing as well with these different colored networks, kind of. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm fairly open to. So if Jakub, you would like to pick some.
So there were different variations of the sea theme. Like this is collecting from one artist again, like this and this and this, which are probably part of the same series. And then this was the coin thing. That had a seascape as well. And that any pickings, Jakob?
You mean pickings for the next exploration?
Yeah, like test exploration.
Yeah.
An image that you would that talks to you.
I'm still in the post-COVID haze in the bed, so I might be still slow in processing.
Hey, I have a suggestion then. If you would, Jakub, pick some fairly big number, like from 10 to 20, and then Pekko just like clicks
Cool.
it through like this, and we see where we end
Cool.
up.
So let's go like with 12.
Okay, 12. We can see, and then we can. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. It would be this. There probably was 12 pictures because they
Yeah,
cycle.
yeah. I say +1.
Okay, we'll pick
Yeah.
this one. I'll put this in the mirror board. I'll stop sharing because I have to kind of tackle with the computer. It takes a second. but not long. So I put it
Yeah.
to the right of that
That's a
device.
destiny.
What was it called? They have usually these sort of database names, so we're dealing with. Okay. Probably this one. No, wasn't this one. I'll take this off. Too many DBXs. Like they all have the same. Oh, there's two DBXs, so that's the reason. Okay, so it's this one. All right. So here it is. I can do the screen sharing again. So maybe one thing to say on this is, like, one can think of this as almost like generation of raw material. Like for me, for example, if there is an interesting, unusual idea, then that idea that develops from there can be honed and polished, and that can become its own form. Like, for example, now I'm quite interested in, from the earlier process, the kind of different operations on reading, as like reading as sculpting instruments, and coming up with ways to sculpt instruments out of reading. Like what you read, what kind of things you do to the text, or what your interpretation of it to sculpt instruments out of it, and that in itself can be an element towards an operation in itself. So, like, we can think of this as kind of like ways to produce raw material. That's at least one way to think about it. But since I talk too much, I can give the start for you if you want, and I can say, like, really, like noting anything out of this is a possible starting point. It doesn't have to be super deep to get going.
Okay, I can start, and this is definitely not super deep. I'll just like point out what was pointed earlier as well. This like round-shaped circle formations that are existent both in the kind of these almost like volcano islands, and also in the artificial construction in the middle, but also in the coastline. So this seems to be like inside one great volcano, all these other kind of volcanoes. And then again, we have the launch pad for a rocket where my cursor is at the moment, it seems. And so there is some sort of like aiming upwards as well, and we are looking from our camera perspective is above the clouds, and there are other round shape forms, at least almost those rockets as well, or what are they that flow, and then there are the moons. There are at least 3 moons that are kind of round shaped. So this is really the kind of round format everywhere present.
I could do so that I'll give this a little bit more space that it doesn't run over this earlier one. But okay, just to produce raw material, I could write here. You can make your own or change this, etc. But I start with circles as a theme. Then I'll point out the do some mirror magic. Natural, so to speak, but then the natural has concentricness. I know that concentricness is not really a word, but it works. But then there is also like constructed, like against the natural. So we have constructed. Then those have are able to build arms to themselves, like because the artificial one has arms. And then I put with a question mark, like the arms can be thought of as relations. That's a possibility. Then, like, let's call it circular recursivity. This is my way of saying like how this whole thing is within a circle or sphere. And then I think it was an interesting point you made that not only the basis of the rockets are not only circular, but they are very similar than these islands. Like if one goes close there, it's actually a similar shape. So rockets, which are things that launch. I wanted to point that out, that there are things that launch because they are things that go elsewhere have so circular basis. And you made some other points, but that's for starters.
Yeah, I now like because you mentioned about the rockets, I almost think that this like round shape is it's a cultural thing that has kind of formed from the kind of nature of surrounding landscapes, something like that. So and there is really, as you said, those arms are kind of connecting. They are connectors, connecting to they're kind of connecting circles in a sense.
Yeah, and they actually lead to launch pads.
Can we thought launch pads as just like arms as well? They are connecting to other clusters or other planets.
This is true. Like, let's put it this way. Let's call it side. So, like from here, of course, like one direction comes is that I find interesting is sort of okay, circle. What is a circle? It's also a loop, and let me actually just put that as a potential thought is circles as loops. And what I like in, say, an organizational or a game structure, there is often like ultimately they are full of looping structures. So, like, what could be an operation that that figures loops out of any source?
Oh yeah, don't yet kind of. I don't have an answer to that, but like then the kind of circle is also something that sculpts, because it's a kind of it's a generative structure, probably based in the landscapes, probably based to the nature of physics, but at the same time it's also a design principle because or cultural principle because it is existing in the artificial constructs as well, and I kind of I think that this like a looping and a circling structure, it is actually a way to sculpt.
Yeah, that's okay. So let's put. I mean, anybody can add. Like I just try to encourage that by writing as much as possible. Sculpting. It's like this, and this comes to my mind. Like there is so if one thinks of operations of forming circles, one of these is like if I form a practice out of it, I could call it. I know this is not a word either, but perimetrial sculpting. And so by using the word or abusing the word perimeter. And that is like if you take one thing, if there is one thing and you form a perimeter out of it, you're kind of forming a circle around it. Of course, it could be a different shape than a circle, but like we can imagine that there's one thing and one builds a fence around it. It's often could be circular in itself. So like, and so can one like what? Well, one direction from here would be like what are the like if we form these sort of perimeters around things as we often do, like especially mentally, like what if we thought of them as more like loops, and what kind of operations would come from there? Um, um, let's put as an explanation around a thing, and then a question, which is what if this was that's a possibility of operation.
Perhaps also analogy which came to my mind looking at those circles is kind of membranes, which are kind of separating the outside from the inside, and
Yeah,
also kind of semi-permeable, like enabling some kind of access or like exchange or flow from outside to inside, which is limited in some ways because yeah, here it's by the size perhaps, or in one dimension, or something like that.
yeah, it's forming insides and outsides, uh, uh, or circling as forming insides and outsides, but nevertheless, that's the end result. Well, and then if one thinks of that, there's also, as you said, partial or insides with an axis.
Yeah, and kind of like permeability, or like says partially permeable to transit from inside of to outside, or outside to inside of, yeah, I don't know of what, but
it's actually good, like in a way it doesn't have to be what, it's almost like when you're thinking in this way, you're very much in the realm of kind of operations, like you can later add the what, but you're looking at what's happening in a way, or you're looking at more the angle of what does it do, like what's its pattern of doing in a way. Like it could have a target, but it's more like a general pattern. Yeah, like
kind of on the kind of patterns. This is straight out from the image, not following our logic here, but I seem to notice that because this is a living ground, it's volcanic ground, it seems that if there is a looping kind of process, it's probably like generating more material on the kind of on the circular structures. I mean, these islands seem to be kind of rising out of the sea. At the moment, you can still even like there are kind of these rings of land, but in the middle you see water kind of going into the kind of island areas, and so it's kind of a rising. There is more material coming, and that makes it a little like hard situation for the kind of artificial construction, because at the moment it doesn't have that many that much space in the water for its arms. It needs to start to kind of reach for the skies, because it is really, if the land is rising, it is getting very hard to exist there, not to mention like to expand there with these arms and go further. And the area is probably like where it can go, it's already circled, because this seems to be inside a big circle, this whole area here.
Yeah, it's that's a good point. I wonder where I would put it. Like it's like this, like okay, there's this whole pattern here. Is that, I mean, you could have different ways of circles as sculpting, but one pattern here is this sort of volcanic. Like what kind of process is the like volcanic process is essentially like there is a generator, which here is, or in the case of volcano, it's a lava, and that shoots out, but what it leaves out is this sort of circular pattern in itself, and then that forms these sort of containers, and then containers within containers, which then builds this sort of that you have this sort of extensions of the arms, but they are limited, as you said, and then that builds another pressure, which is pressure point, which is to reach out, you need to go beyond the circle. It's actually a really interesting take on inside and outside structure overall, like because like people often have this sort of like almost like a like not negative but slightly awkward relation between forming insides and outside, like nothing is really outside and nothing is inside, but on the other hand we constantly need to form, like okay, we make a group, therefore we talk about things that are inside, like we need this kind of framing in order to think, even though it's kind of artificial. So it's something that is very permeable or goes throughout the human operation style. So one could kind of look at this from that perspective as well. Like, and it's a take on inside outside forming. The looping is almost like a different perspective. It's like it's more about the circle, traveling the path of a circle. Maybe I'll add that part. But it's like an alternative direction.
Seems to, for me, this seems to kind of suggest that this really is some sort of like, I'm not saying like mining operation, but they are clearly kind of trying to create or extract something here, and this kind of, because there is not that much space, it seems to be some sort of like it's more like if you make choices, if you decide something, that will then limit you your further kind of choices. But you all every time you whenever you have the possibility of kind of going into another planet, or even like forming another planet, or the same sort of like landscape that you have like here, and I kind of mean that it's this seems to suggest more like some sort of like sketching compared to like drawing or kind of playing things kind of in a very like or designing things in a very like detailed level, or something like that.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, I was thinking that from this angle of, like, I was starting to turn this into, or one area of this into an operation, which then becomes like operation can become a basis of a role, and the basis of a role can become a building block for a kind of organization. So that kind of a pathway, like just like sketching that out, and like as you said, the choice limits you. But if you start by choosing some generator, and generator in the widest sense, like maybe your generator is reading a text, or it's a random list of things that generates different things, or it's a conversation, but that's your generator. And while the generator in one perspective is taking you forward, like you're developing, but from another perspective, it's forming a circle around, because it's almost like you're traveling in a tunnel, like of that generator. So in a way, that tunnel is a circle of traveling. So, but you can put the emphasis on the kind of advancing, or you can put the emphasis on the kind of contour. You probably could put it in other things as well. So, but here it's have this sense of the volcano, which is like I would say this sort of generator, but then like leaving this traces of a circle of the crest of the volcano, and especially with this water emphasizing the crests, and leaving these sort of circles in there. So like the start of the operation is like looking at the generator from the idea of what it encircles, like what is inside of it and what is outside of it. But then like the rest of this image and the rest of what has been kind of extracted out of it kind of proposes this sort of like interesting systems of like, what if you generate with another thing, and you look at the circle it forms, and you form this sort of constellations of different insides of generators, or generative processes, and with that you could play with say the rest of the elements that have been pointed out from this image itself.
If you can create circles, kind of should it be more like you start from the kind of most inner circle, and then you do another circle and another circle, and then at some point you may draw a circle that around all the circles or some of the circles, and or should you kind of or then another way of looking at it is like you can draw a big circle or three big circles and start like generating circles inside these big circles, probably, or that can also like overlap with each other. But
I actually got an interesting operation from there, unlike what you were saying. This is kind of Jakob's insides and outside. So the operation goes essentially as follows. I have to make some space. Let's move some text. So you have like these two things. Like, one is the what's inside of this. It's rather what's an inside. What's an inside of this, whatever your context is, and then you also form a circle called O, which is what's an outside of this. So wherever you are, you can look like you are in some context. But what is the further context inside of this? Like inside of this, say this image, we can say there is an inside, which is like easy one would be the building here. It forms its own, or any of these circles. Like inside you're in a dinner and there's a dinner table, but then there are plates and you can simply say that's an inside of this. But then you can always ask the question of the circle O, which what is an outside of this? Like inside, you're in a dinner scene, there is an outside, which is say the whole house. Like you're in a I don't know, living room having dinner, but then there is a circle, which is the apartment, say. And so it's a kind of like a method of mapping, or of course it's still a very raw method of mapping, but it's an interesting way of thinking of playing with this inside and outside. Like what are the recursive insides that are going inside from your context, and what are the recursive insides that are outside of your context but encircling it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, some kind of like or how I understood it, like some sort of like scene mapping or structuring
Yes.
kind of device.
Yeah, like in a way, like simplified to a kind of like like a simple two questions. And of course, you could find many. It's not that there's one necessarily. There usually is probably multiple, but it's still a kind of way of approaching things. I think like from here, like looking at this, like the one quality with this is like it really feels like almost like, I don't know, sculpting or making an artwork or something. Like the first things you produce are kind of raw material and just gather it, and it's still raw, and then you kind of refine it and it's still sort of raw, but now it seems to have like some suggestions of kind of refinement, and then you go further and you refine from here. Like this actually now suggests to me this I don't know, you could think of it as a role, which is the like analyst of like insides and outsides, like that you're looking at like every operation in terms of what it's, where it's drawing inside and outside lines.
So that sorry.
No, do say.
That it just brought my mind that at the same time it's some kind of like diversification system, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
How to kind of make difference between areas or so.
Yeah, like so let's put role. Like I'm not sure what to do with that yet, but it's certainly a possibility. And it's an interesting idea, and it's also a reflection of this quality, which I think is a kind of general quality of this kind of approach, is that it's bringing these forms that are kind of related to some forms that we see in the world, but also kind of unusual. Like it actually makes sense that somebody would have this perspective that they're looking at, say, a conversation and thinking, oh, they are saying this and that because they are taking these and these inside, but what's outside of them, what they're saying is that and that. and if you would take this sort of this is also like it's a role. Of course, every role is a filter, but I'll just also highlight that you can take it just in a very pragmatically filter-like way, that you listen to something in terms of like what's its inside, and that kind of a thing in itself could bring out like interesting notions, or find like useful things out of a process in itself. Like that's a possibility, and then of course that could uh, just search for exits from the inside. I mean, not that you have to do that, but it's an interesting possibility for that role, is that if you find an inside where something is, you search for exits, and exits are by nature that they are somehow like in this picture, like what Jakub was pointing out earlier, that there are like in the foreground there is this one circle that has permeability, like so that permeability is part of the kind of the circle. Like it takes knowing the circle to know where you can exit it, so to speak.
Yeah, and really like in that image, why is there that's kind of from distance they look like very big yachts, kind of, or exploration ships going in the water, and why would you build that sort of or deploy that sort of like ships if you can just like stay inside in this kind of very short, very close looking like lake area, and really like other thing about the loops and kind of as the loops are something that like that have different, like you could say steps, or kind of they have a process, and therefore like there is time included. And I just like started to think that I really like this like circling just like as a form, because when I think of this game that you referred, like Microscope, for instance, where you have this like linear time that you then start to kind of fill with events and stuff like that, and shorter periods of time, I find it very much like I kind of find it very exciting to think about like not deciding this sort of like big linear time, but more like drawing circles of processes and looking at the inside and outside or something like that.
Yeah, I'll put that in like circular time mapping. Like, of course, we have elements of that once again in the more conventional world. Even the clock itself goes by daytime circle, but then in a much more, let's say, nuanced manner, one can think of like how things consist of loops and loops upon loops. Like in a way, like there is this, or loop-like structures. Like even this conversation goes that there is a kind of, like one can think of one comment as a kind of loop of its own, like or then there is like, well, I kind of have it in my head, but I don't know how to describe the picture, how you draw this sort of, in a way, it's a looping structure. That conversation has a comment and another comment and another comment in itself. And it has the structure even if it's not following like a strict turn order. So that kind of points out this sort of uh, like if you would have a, actually I'll change that to role. This neuron starts to behave. The circular time mapping just into a role of circular time mapper. I mean, there probably would be a better name for it, but like this idea that somebody looks at a process, in terms of what kind of loops it forms. Maybe call it also just a loop mapper.
Good. Yeah, this reminds of how you described the latest session before this, like cards having kind of creative potential to create other kind of cards, kind of looping structure.
Yeah, also that, like how, and that's also like sort of a helix-like loop. If the card creates another card, which then creates its own loop to create another card, it's a loop that kind of iterates by change. That every round can be different, but it's still a looping structure potentially. And I think like really like here like whether one finds like snip like a picture of a whole action, which I think one could find here as well. But even if one finds this sort of interesting patterns of operation, which are then still like little elements of thinking that that you could expand into being a role-like thing or a part of certain kind of a role. Like what if you take the role of the loop mapper, that you are in a process, but you're mapping like how things are going in loops and what kind of loops it could use, like maybe further loops that are not yet there, like essentially designing loop. I'll put that you could design for a process different loops that it could potentially take, and that while it can be here as a role, it doesn't have to be here. It could be like generally interesting role-like thing, potentially useful in other contexts. So like, because like one reason I find this whole area interesting is that I think over these years, but also this sort of XORG process, the one thing that is clear is that one limiting factor in terms of like thinking organizations is that is the kind of cultural or the limits of the cultural scope of what happens inside of organizations and what kind of roles can we have, etc. And while there are certainly that's somewhat expanded by games, it's still like in what somewhat limited sphere even with that. So there is not this sort of like a wide field of mapping of like that it's not easy to think of like loop designer or inside outside analyst kind of as a base of operations, because we don't have those kind of roles. So what I find interesting here is that once you start this way, you suddenly can come up with these things like sculptor reader, loop designer, which might still be a little bit raw, but like have like refinement potential. Like if you take this and you start playing around with them and have a little bit like game-like feeling, that you don't immediately have to say why it's useful, but it's like what's cool to do as a loop designer, what kind of drawings I would do, what kind of style of illustration I would have if I'm, or what kind of diagrams I would draw if I'm a loop designer. Of course, many diagrams are loop-like, but maybe loop designer has its own style. And once you start to populate that space, you are likely to find like not just a different approach, but kind of different way of thinking, and probably also a different way of expressing. So from here, I think like if as a kind of slightly playful way, I could also take this into almost like a board of an organization. Is like here's a very rough sketch of a game that one could play just with this image almost being a board. So you start with the generator, the generator creates things, and yes, you look at what it generates, that's like the pool of water here, but you look at the things that it kind of, they form a circle of it, like things that it does not go outside of. Like, let's say, I mean, an easy example, if you would take like, say, a dungeon generator and generates all kinds of rooms, and there's an infinite set of possibilities, but they all kind of have this sort of cave uh, uh, room design. So there is a circle that is this sort of a sense of an, um, say, an underground labyrinth is one way to describe the circle, or something else. Then you start forming like other circles inside of it, like what if there is a generator for, I don't know, like could be an example like I don't know, like a hazards, like things that could happen there, and that could have generators of like collapses and cave-ins and water torrents and whatever there is, but that forms its own circle, and then you start forming this as kind of its own circles of insides and outsides. From there, I mean, you can have I don't know how it continues from there, but there's a kind of interesting game design there. Like the idea always being that there's this generator, and then the generator provides its own circle. And of course, like I could have used another example, like I could use an organizational generator that creates ideas, or application generator that maybe is done as a brainstorm that people or like people generate different application ideas, but then that forms some kind of a circle of its own, and then you can form circles within it, like to, in a way, the circles can also highlight and emphasize certain areas. Like if you are actually interested in certain area in it, you form a generator on it, and then that becomes a circle of its own. Um, so yeah, the context could be many uh, uh, from that approach.
One thing that would be kind of interesting, this is kind of a very, for me, this is very field image, but with lots of like stuff. But there were other this similar sort of like seascapes that were more open. But that doesn't really make a difference. But like one thing that would be very interesting also would be to kind of imaging more like things into this image, kind of to lay out or to remove kind of something out of the image kind of during the process of like generating and designing roles and so on, kind of in order to or maybe like take preliminary roles during this like discussion process and already start kind of shaping the image to better suit your exploration into the role we are currently whenever like discussing about and so on.
Or taking the roles that you have, or whatever you have generated here, and taking it to another image. That's also possible. Like um,
Yeah.
you can take the image itself, but you could take also the pieces you've developed. Like if one brings to this earlier image now, say, the loop designer, that makes me now think like, okay, there's these sculptures that are taking all kinds of material, and they have their own techniques of producing other things out of it, but with the interest of like creating instruments or like tools of process in itself. And but then maybe there is a loop that there is this observational that is looking at this, from on high, these things that are generating and looking at the different directions, and maybe they are picking pieces that are particularly tough knots from there that are interesting and dropping them down. And then there is like a third role, which is like gnawing, which is like taking these tough knots and having its own techniques of just cracking through the knot. For example, like just like repeatedly redescribing it, or like coming up with all kinds of direction. So that's the Hound, and this is now a potential loop designed between the sculptures and the Raven and the Hound. And once again, a kind of slice. So it can go that way, or you could take things from here and things from here and say bring them into, I don't know, like these are fairly simple, like for example into the image here, and it's like who knows what that produces, but that's a possibility. Like actually, like I can imagine now that from here you could have come up with an ideas of like this sort of like quick repurposing and covering the ground to like the span of, say, an organization. Like you create the floor of the organization quickly, and that could be a role in itself, which could open these sort of directions of how you can like take over a ground of a certain place. Like okay, I can see that this might open up this sort of direction that like how do you can create organizations inside of, say, a certain chat room, like what kind of things you repurpose that you create a chat, like an organization inside a chat room. Like not that the chat room is an organization, but you kind of lure people inside the chat room to organize themselves. That's kind of like, for me, a picture of this this floor. But then like if I bring in here like loops that might bring in considerations of, okay, what are the loops of that practice, or insides and outsides could bring other thoughts, and so on and so forth.
Would also be very interesting to kind of think the elements in this. Let's say we take 4 images and then we put them close to each other, and more like what do they suggest? Like I mean, what sort of like elements are in a sense like transferable between the images, like or what sort of like ecosystems of dynamics can you create out of let's say 4 images that are not like kind of that are equal in their like so that they are all like equal images.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that, like where this could go, like earlier before the session, and I could see like in these sort of textual descriptions that we were just producing here, if more would be made, what you could simply have is, roughly speaking, an import, if we use a computer terminology, but like pulling from library. Like somebody has written, say the loop designer, and this becomes a point that somebody actually writes the loop designer operations. Or here is at least the start of the reader sculpture, like extraction operations, shaping operations, experimentation, like how they experiment. But like, of course, it would be more well written. So when you start with, say, a new image and you think it's useful to, say, to bring a reader sculpture in, you just import it, meaning like you, like pragmatically speaking, you make a link to it. So in a way, like you don't always have to start from the rawest of the raw. You can also bring the refined into the raw, and kind of utilize those things to create new perspectives towards it. Like so yeah, like we can imagine that somewhere here is import loop designer, import something else, and that essentially forms this sort of process of refinement is the word I'm looking for, and process of not starting from the beginning with the source.
Yeah, that's sort of like kind of database where to search for different like kind of operations or mechanics or roles or whatever, kind of based on kind of search phrase, or it's kind of, now I'm thinking something related to reading, because I see someone reading there and I could already like check out what sort of like tools we have in terms of like this sort of like association also.
Yeah, everything that is tagged with reading or interpreting, or something like of course you could tag them as well. Yeah, because I'm thinking like there's this, I don't know if it's a problem in general, but like there is so much kind of structural, not just structural understanding, but like what could one call it, like process understanding that has been kind of packed into our processes or our Gestalt mindset. It would be interesting to try to bring that out in some game form. I was thinking, like I have respect for Grandeur as a project, but in terms of like organizational understanding, we could make something that is certainly like likely to produce interesting directions for organization, likely to fabricate, to illustrate or sketch out organizational structures. Of course, there is also structures that are more analytical towards organization, but this sort of like a new idea or idea applied to a certain direction of how it could be organized and what kind of possibilities there could be. That's a area of play that is not that existing. Most of the forms don't do that. They mostly say like, here is a model like you can use, or but they don't like imagine out using the material or the area as material in itself. So I think it's an interesting direction, not the only interesting direction, but it would be interesting direction to not only as a tool for people to do that, but also as a tool to express this sort of wider sense of potential organizational culture, like how much more wider. Like for me, it's interesting. You could be you could make yourself a loop designer and move like that around, and you could create a relation with somebody who is a sculpture reader because you find an interesting connection with them, and you form a pair, or maybe a third one comes in, and then you use that for a while, or it's something that is in your back pocket and you use it every Thursday to create something. You don't use it only to play a game that that kind of dies with the game in itself, like you like a normal paradigm of a game is you play the game, but then the results are kind of like in a limbo. But you could use that form to generate something, and that generation could be inserted into the world, so to speak.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting and brings to my mind this like storytelling dices. Okay, this time I select 5 dices, and this time I want to take 3 out of these categories and 2 out of these categories, and I just want to see, because we are 5 today, or kind of, or something like that, kind of how they mix when I throw them and see what comes out of it, and so on. But I mean, the generative kind of combinatory power is kind of like unlimited, because you can do almost unlimited amount of like connections between the kind of cards or like of the entries, and then that is only the beginning, because you start using them the way you kind of want or the way they suggest or so on.
Yeah, I didn't notice Jakob's chat. He had to jump off, but too bad. I wanted last comments from him. But yeah, it's still wondering. It's still kind of exploring the space. But I do think the space is interesting in itself. But I think maybe it's good to search for this sort of maybe consolidations in the sense of, okay, this method, that method, this way of playing. I'm a bit worried that people get at some point frustrated with the sort of nature of play that takes you always in a new place. I like it because it's ultimately you need to do that in order to find the new things, which you can then package later into something that others can understand. But like I think it might be good to try to find ways to consolidate from here.
I think you in some cases I do kind of recognize that, like that sort of like feeling. It's not, I don't have it because I also like everything I encounter, I kind of also try to think everything I do, and then how can I kind of learn something. But then again, that's more like a learning aspect as well, or kind of some sort of like thinking or educating oneself or something. But I do understand that there might be, it might be good if there would be kind of some sort of like different like paths, and one of these paths would kind of be quite aware of its like goals or what is kind of what are the next like checkpoints. But I certainly like the myself, I like the laboratory or like kind of sessions where there kind of every time there is also like new kind of attributes and new pieces and tokens that are then like reassembled and so on. But I share the same kind of what you said.
Yeah, it's like yeah, it's a sort of balancing act, like like in the sense like once you provide fences, you say, okay, these are now the rules, and we have tested these rules several times, and we know they work because we have tested them or we have polished them into a certain fineness. That's both a limitation in itself, but it's also something that creates assuredness, but then it also creates something that can be communicated outside, like certainly easier. Like on the other hand, you never arrive into the possibility of creating interesting fences if you don't kind of travel somewhere outside where you could find where to put the fence point, so to speak. So like it's balancing between that, like, okay, now we are kind of like traveling the outside and finding potential interesting points of area setting, versus now we have selected an area and are really consolidating that area, and even going to the process of now we have actually figured out the area, and now we want to express that area to others. So those are all different kind of states, and I think maybe it would be good to try to bring a bit of this sort of consolidation of forms. But like at the same time, like there's so much like interesting forms where you could it could happen. It's both this sort of like the kind of perspectives that we have like in this sort of layer filter op and type and scene and setting that structure in itself, and then this sort of card approach as a form of expression, like that you ultimately want to make expressions that are generative. That's also an interesting area. So yeah, there are many choices also from which to consolidate.
This is probably a very good discussion for a session where most of the kind of active people are present, because then it would be very good to also like hear what people think and so on. But yeah, I really enjoy like exploring new areas or also like bringing material and ideas from different areas that have been visited earlier and so on, like scrambling and kind of playing with material and ideas from different like contexts and so on.
Yeah, let's think about that. Like once we have, like, of course, like different people are busy at different times, but it's a conversation we could have like in some fashion. It's like maybe picking from what we have and trying to think of ways to consolidate. I do think there is a combination there that is quite close, which is this sort of, I think there is something in this approach of like treating the whatever outputs as almost like this sort of in a tarot card generative nature, that when, for example, you can express a concept of anomaly mining, but if the wrapping of it is not like it's just a concept definition, but it's more like a playable piece in itself. Like it's about like trying to describe how do you play that, how do you play anomaly mining in itself, just as an example. But that form of expression is interesting because it's also potentially modular, like in this card-like nature, that then anomaly mining is a Lego piece in a way, or a card, and other pieces can be as well. Like there's something there, and then there's something in these sort of general approaches. But that's something maybe to think for next week. But this is interesting in terms of, I mean, this is mining. This is, by the way, anomaly mining in some ways, because what it's bringing is anomalies of organizational behavior in the widest sense of the word organization. Like these sort of roles or models are certainly anomalies from the conventional reality that we have not.
Yeah, and that's a really kind of as a kind of like not key theme, or but more like a kind of lens or some sort of like focus point. I really like the idea of like trying to kind of whatever playing and toying with, but also always trying to kind of land on these different like anomalies, and then trying to excavate what is it kind of made of, or what is it like attached to, or so on.
Yeah, but let's think about that. Like what kind of directions might be interesting to propose on that, like and we can go forward from there. It's probably a good conclusion point, which means that I can stop sharing and say goodbye to the potential people.
Goodbye. Yeah, I'll go as well and try to rest a bit after a long week. So
Yes, thanks
Yeah.
for being here. Let's
Yeah.
stop the recording